Hey guys, how's it going? It's John again from Haive Music, and I wanted to move forward with our sidechain related tutorials here and kind of touch on a topic that I'm sure everyone can relate to in Ableton, and that's freezing sidechain compressed tracks. And of course, if you've used Ableton for any length of time and you've got a track and a compressor which you just so happen to have sidechain compression enabled on, and you go to freeze it, you can't. Ableton yells at you and says, yeah, you're not allowed to do that. So unfortunately, when Ableton was releasing version 10 here earlier this year, there was a lot of push from the community to incorporate a feature that would allow people to just simply right click and freeze a compressed track. But yeah, unfortunately, that feature didn't make the cut, and we're still working around that issue. So how do we work around that issue? Well, there are a couple different ways of doing it. The easiest is if you group your tracks and kind of lay your projects out like this. So you basically have a drums group, a leads group, bass group. Basically what you want to do is take your track that you want to freeze and put it in a group. And we want to basically move this compressor from the individual track that you want to freeze to the parent group. So now you can go ahead and freeze your track, which is awesome. And that's exactly what you want. We've got our track frozen, and of course it's feeding into the parent, which has a compressor on it. So if we go in here, the sidechain compression is still being triggered. And that's all fine and good. But you know, how do we do it if we don't want the entire group? Say we just want our Plux group over here, our Plux track to be sidechained, but we don't want lead 1 and lead 2 to be sidechained as well. Well, how do we work around that? Because if you just chuck this on the parent group, well, then that's going to create a group that has everything that's contained within that group that's also being sidechained. That's going to affect the entire group. So how do we do that? Well, there are a couple different ways. If you're using Ableton 8 or Ableton 9, you don't have the ability to do groups in groups. So what you'd be left to do is basically remove that track from its group and put it in its own Plux group. Then of course you can move this up over to here, and you could basically do the exact same thing that we went around there. With the incorporation of Ableton 10, however, you can now do groups within groups. So what you could do is you could basically create a group of Plux inside of, say, your leads group, and then you can go ahead and, of course, move your individual compressor to that group, and then that's gonna do everything there, which is all fine and great. But maybe you don't want to do that either, because maybe you have some other ones. So how do you work around that? Well, what you would probably do, and this is kind of the way that I prefer to do it, is to use routing in Ableton. And what do I mean by that? And it's basically to route the audio of this track into another track, and that track we're going to use to control the sidechain compression. So what we want to do is basically create a new track in our group or wherever. It's going to be easier to keep track of if we have it within our group, and let's call it SC Plux for sidechain Plux. And basically what we want to do is move this compressor from our actual track that we want to freeze up into our SC Plux. And maybe we'll change this to be a different color yellow, just to differentiate between the two, as this being an input and this being a source track. And so that, of course, now we can go ahead and freeze the tracks, but we're still missing the sidechain. So what we need to do now is basically find a way to tell Ableton to send the output of this particular track into this track, which of course we can do by using these little controls here. So if you don't see this option here, this section, it's an I/O for input output button right here. And if you click this guy and you enable him, that gives you your inputs and it gives you your outputs. So if we toggle that on, now what we want to do is we want to change by default. Basically, when you create a track in a group in Ableton, it by default sets it to a leads group output. Now we want to basically change that to our SC Plux track that we made, which we'll find in our list here. So we go ahead, change that to SC Plux. You can see now SC Plux gives us the option to change this to an input track. And so now, if we listen to this, that's the actual track. But if we listen to the actual input track, we can hear that the output of our Plux is being fed into our SC Plux, which is feeding back into our leads group, which is feeding into the master. So you can start doing some pretty crazy routing here in Ableton, which is nice. And what this allows us to do, of course, is freeze our track. So now we've got our track frozen. We've freed up those resources that are on there, and we've still got our sidechain available, which we can hear if we drop that down. So that's kind of a nice way to handle those type of situations that I've found, and it's a little bit cleaner than having, you know, groups with inside of groups with inside of groups, which I know is a huge deal when it comes to Ableton 10, and I'm really happy that they added that because it allows for even further functionality when doing, you know, advanced routing techniques and things like that. But just for the sake of, if you are in Ableton 8 or 9 and you don't have groups and groups, or B, you don't want to do groups and groups, this is probably my preferred method for working around sidechaining tracks like that. And unfortunately, what you end up sometimes with in very large tracks when you're doing this, or very large projects, I should say, is where you have, you know, a lot of these SC tracks that are accepting input. But, you know, in the long run, it clutters things up a little bit, but it really can free up a lot of resources when you're working with limited buffer space and some very large projects that are using a lot of processing power. So I'm sure that you know, hopefully that'll help you guys out. I know that that's something that I run into pretty frequently here now on, you know, as your tracks kind of continue to grow larger and become more and more complex. So yeah, hopefully it helps you guys out. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Take care.